The last thing the Verlva remembered before her runes stopped working was a man asking a farmer for food. That was how it had started. Not with prophecy, not with divine decree, not with the crack of Bifrost or the howl of Fenrir or any of the signs that the 9 realms had been trained over centuries to recognize as the beginning of something consequential. It had started with a bald man in a yellow suit walking out of a forest where 11 Draugr had just ceased to exist, asking a broad-shouldered farmer named Björn where he could find something to eat. Björn had pointed at the village hall. The man had said thank you. He had paid for his food. He had looked at the gray Midgard sky with the mild, evaluating expression of someone trying to remember which direction they had originally been heading. And the direction he had originally been heading was toward a supermarket where crab was on discount, which was so far from where he had ended up that the distance between those two facts was itself a kind of measurement of how badly the universe had miscalculated something. That was part 1. A man, a forest, 11 Draugr, and a farmer who aged several years in a single afternoon. By the time Kratos read the footprints on the road outside, that village footprints that carried none of the weight of a warrior, none of the muscle memory of someone who had ever needed to be afraid, the trembling had already begun. By the time Thor came down from the sky with Mjolnir extended, and the lightning gathering above him, and the full conviction of a god who had never once been the second strongest thing in a room, the trembling was already in the roots. By the time Thor threw everything he had, and the man in yellow rocked back half a step and asked, in a tone of genuine mild inquiry, whether he was done, by that moment, every Sather practitioner in every realm had already felt the first pulse move through the ground beneath their feet. And now Odin was in his war room, reading the same Raven report for the 3rd time, and the report kept saying the same thing. And the thing it kept saying was the thing that had kept him awake through the long Asgardian night. Full strike, full lightning, half a step, cape straightened, done. Everything that made this moment inevitable happened before this video started. And if you did not see it happen, then you do not yet understand what Odin is actually afraid of. Somewhere above this video, part 1 is waiting, the forest, the footprints, the farmer, and the moment Thor Odinson threw the full weight of divine thunder at something that treated it like a minor inconvenience. Subscribe if you want to know how this ends. But go watch part 1 first, because when Odin makes his next move, you will need to understand exactly what he already failed to stop. Thor's report arrived in Asgard before Thor did, carried by a raven that Odin had stationed along the southern road specifically for this purpose, because Odin had learned centuries ago that first-hand accounts from Thor were less reliable than secondary observation due to Thor's tendency to edit events in the direction of his own performance. The raven's account was clinical and complete, full strike with Mjolnir, full lightning deployment, direct contact confirmed. Subject displaced half a step. Subject did not retaliate. Subject asked if Thor was done. Odin read this 3 times with the patience of someone reading a document that kept saying the same impossible thing, and hoping that patience would eventually cause it to say something different. It continued to say the same impossible thing. He set it down on the table of his war room, which was a room that had seen the planning of more conflicts than most civilizations had existed through. And he stood at the window and looked out at Asgard with the expression of a man performing a very serious and very private recalibration. The problem was not that something powerful had appeared in his realm. Powerful things appeared regularly. It was one of the occupational inconveniences of ruling a cosmology that attracted ambition and chaos in roughly equal proportion. The problem was the specific shape of this power, the way it sat outside every category he had built his governance around. Odin's control of the 9 realms was not purely physical. It was informational. He knew things. He knew what people wanted, what they feared, what they were capable of, what their limits were, where those limits could be pressed and where they would break. Knowledge was the actual mechanism of his power, and every being that existed within Yggdrasil's structure was knowable, because every being within Yggdrasil's structure was part of a system that Odin had spent his entire existence learning to read. Something with no thread in the weave was not just physically uncontrollable. It was epistemically uncontrollable. He could not know it. He could not predict it. He could not use it because using something required understanding its motivations. And its motivations, a crab sale, the man had apparently mentioned a crab sale, were so far outside any framework Odin had for understanding divine or mortal behavior that they constituted a form of camouflage more effective than any spell he had ever encountered. He called for Freya. She arrived with the careful, measured composure of someone who had been expecting this summons and had used the time to prepare both her arguments and her defenses. Odin looked at her across the war room table and said, without preamble, "You have been watching it." Freya said, "I have been watching everything. That is not a confession, it is a description of my habits." Odin said, "What do you make of it?" Freya considered this with the genuine attention she gave difficult questions, setting aside the adversarial layer of their relationship for long enough to engage with the substance. She said, "It is not malicious. Everything I have seen suggests it arrived without intention, is staying without agenda, and its only expressed desire is to return to wherever it came from." She paused. "That makes it either the least dangerous thing to ever appear in these realms or the most dangerous, depending entirely on what happens to change its mind," Odin said, "and Kratos has taken it into the realm between realms." Freya's expression shifted slightly at this, the careful composure adjusting to accommodate a new variable. She said, "Then Kratos believes it matters. Kratos does not take things between realms unless he believes they matter." Odin said, "Kratos believes everything that threatens my control matters." Freya said, "In that case, his track record is excellent." Odin turned back to the window. He said, "I am going to open the Ginnungagap." The silence that followed this statement was immediate and absolute in the way that silences only became when the thing that had just been said was enormous enough to push all other sounds out of the room. Freya said, carefully, "The primordial void, the space before creation. Odin, nothing that goes into the Ginnungagap comes back with its nature intact. Whatever it is when it enters, it is something else when it exits." "If it exits," Odin said, "I'm not sending it in. I'm opening a channel between here and there just wide enough to look through, to see if whatever this being came from left any record on the other side of existence." Freya said, "You want to look outside Yggdrasil." Odin said, "I want to know if outside Yggdrasil is a place with rules, because if it has rules I can learn them, and if I can learn them I can use them." Freya looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to argue and concluding that the argument was already lost. She said, "And if it doesn't have rules," Odin said, "then we are in a situation I have not prepared for, and I will need to begin preparing very quickly." He said it with the flat, pragmatic calm of someone who found the prospect of an unprepared-for situation less frightening than most people would, because he had spent so much of his existence turning unprepared-for situations into prepared-for ones through the simple application of sufficient intelligence and ruthlessness. The preparations for opening the Ginnungagap channel took 6 hours and involved 7 practitioners of the deepest Sather in Asgard, 3 sacrifices that Odin made personally and recorded in a private ledger he kept for exactly this category of transaction, and the temporary dismantling of a ward that had been maintained continuously for 400 years, because removing it created the only geometrically viable angle from which the channel could be opened. When it opened as a point of darkness in the center of the war room, small enough to cover with a hand, radiating a cold that was not temperature but the absence of the property that temperature described, the cold of a place where the concepts that generated warmth had not yet been invented. Odin looked through it. He looked for a long time, with his one eye, and with the deeper sight that the eye was a symbol of rather than the source of, the sight he had paid for with the eye in the first place, the sight that could read the structure of things rather than just their surface. What he saw on the other side was not nothing. It was everything else. An infinity of other structures, other systems, other cosmologies arranged in the dark beyond Yggdrasil's reach, each one self-contained, each one operating on its own internal logic, and somewhere among them, he could not isolate it, could not point to it precisely, but could feel its direction the way you could feel the direction of a sound even in total darkness. Somewhere among them was the origin point of the thing now touching Yggdrasil's roots in the realm between realms. He could feel its origin the way he could feel a pulled thread in a tapestry. He could not read the system it came from. Its rules were not his rules. Its structure was not his structure. He could feel it without understanding it, which was the most unsettling possible combination. He closed the channel. He stood in the war room with the residual cold moving across his skin and thought very carefully about what he now knew and what it implied. What it implied was that the being in his realm was not an anomaly within existence. It was a being from a different existence entirely, one that operated by different laws, and the power it carried was not the power of his cosmology at its extreme. It was the power of another cosmology expressed through a body that had arrived here by means that defied the machinery connecting all things within Yggdrasil. It could not be measured against Asgardian standards because it had not been produced by Asgardian conditions. It was not a stronger version of something he knew. It was something else. Categorically, fundamentally, in every way that mattered, something else. He picked up the Raven report from the table and read it one more time. Full strike with Mjolnir. Subject displaced half a step. Subject did not retaliate. He set it down. He said to the empty room because the practitioners had left and Freya had left and the ravens were outside, "Then we do not fight it, we change what it wants." He walked to the door. He stopped. He said quietly, the way people said things they were not certain were true but were committing to anyway. Everything wants something. Even things from outside everything. He opened the door and began giving orders, and the orders were not about armies or weapons or divine power. They were about information, about leverage, about the specific, patient work of finding the place where even the simplest desire could be shaped into a tool. Somewhere in the realm between realms, Yggdrasil continued to carry its signal through roots that had never been asked to carry anything like it before. And the world tree, ancient beyond reckoning and built to contain everything, was beginning to discover the particular difficulty of containing something that had not been part of the original design. The trembling in Yggdrasil's roots did not stop. That was the first thing every practitioner of Sather across all 9 realms noticed simultaneously, which was itself unprecedented. The sudden, shared awareness of a disturbance moving through the world tree like a current through water, felt at the same moment by people separated by distances that normally made simultaneity impossible. In Midgard, a Verlva in the middle of a reading looked up from her runes and said nothing for a long time. In Ulfheim, the light elves paused in their work and looked at each other with the particular expression of craftspeople who have heard a sound from the foundation of the building they are standing in. In Helheim, where the dead went, and where sensation was supposed to be muted by design, Hel herself, daughter of Loki, ruler of the realm of the ordinary dead, a being who had governed a kingdom of endings long enough to have become very calm about most things, placed her hand flat against the ground and felt the signal passing beneath her palm and said, to no one in particular, "That is new." The signal had been traveling for hours. It showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, it was growing clearer. The way a sound sometimes grew clearer as it traveled because the medium carrying it was resonating rather than absorbing. In the realm between realms, Kratos had pulled the boat to rest against one of the great roots of the world tree itself, a root as wide as a longhouse lying on its side, its surface dark and textured with the slow growth of something so old that age had become its primary visible quality. He stood on it with his arms crossed and watched Saitama, who was sitting on the edge of the root with his feet hanging over the dark space below, looking at the structure of the tree around him with the interested, unhurried attention he might have given a particularly large aquarium. Atreus was cross-legged 3 feet away, the reading instrument in his lap, watching the needle, which had not stopped moving since they entered the realm. The needle was not spinning. It was oscillating back and forth, with the regular, rhythmic patience of something responding to a continuous signal rather than a fixed point. Mimir said, "The tree is still talking to him." Kratos said, "He touched it once." Mimir said, "Aye, and it's been answering ever since," which suggests either that the tree found something in that touch it recognized, or that the touch created something the tree is now trying to categorize. Either way, the conversation is ongoing, and neither party appears to have the option of ending it. Saitama said without turning around, "Is the tree actually talking? Because I don't hear anything." Mimir said, "Not in a way that produces sound, no. But information is moving through these roots that wasn't moving before you made contact, and it's moving in a pattern that resembles communication more than it resembles random disturbance." Saitama thought about this. He said, "What's it saying?" Mimir said, "That's the part I genuinely cannot answer because the language it's using, if you want to call it a language, is not one I have any access to. The closest I can come is that it feels like the tree is asking a question it has never had occasion to ask before." Saitama said, "What question?" Mimir said slowly. "What are you?" Saitama turned around at that. He looked at Mimir with the expression of a man who had been asked this question before, many times in many forms, and had long ago concluded that the honest answer was not satisfying to the people asking it. He said, "I'm a guy who got really strong from training." He said it the same way he always said it, with the flat, mild conviction of someone reporting a simple fact, and the simplicity of it hit the complicated, layered, ancient intelligence of Yggdrasil's ongoing inquiry the way a plain wooden hammer hit a glass sculpture. Not with malice, not with force, just with the honest density of something that did not share the assumptions embedded in the thing it was contacting. The root beneath them pulsed, not violently, not with the force of divine power asserting itself, but with the deep, slow rhythm of something enormous and old processing new information at the speed appropriate to its scale. Atreus grabbed the edge of the root and steadied himself. Kratos widened his stance. The pulse passed through the root, into the boat, into the water that was not water around them, and then outward through the rest of the tree with the patient inevitability of a wave that has been generated at the center of a very large body of water and intends to reach every shore. Atreus looked at his instrument and said, "It accepted that." Kratos said, "It accepted what?" Atreus said, "His answer." Whatever he just said to Mimir, the tree read it, not the words, but the truth behind them, the actual nature of what he is, and it accepted it, like it just filed him, like it added him to a record it keeps of everything that passes through the realm. He looked up at Kratos. He said, "Father, Yggdrasil just wrote him into the weave." The silence that followed was the longest one they had shared since entering the realm, because what Atreus had just said was not possible, was not supposed to be possible, was something that the structure of existence had been designed to prevent happening retroactively, because the weave was not a living document that could be amended. It was a fixed record of what was fated to be, and fate did not accept late additions. Because fate, by definition, was complete before the moment it was being asked to accommodate had occurred. Kratos said, "If it wrote him in," Atreus said, "then he has a thread now, a fate, something that is supposed to happen." He looked at his instrument, which had stopped oscillating and settled into a fixed direction with the absolute certainty of a compass that has found north. He said, "And I can read where it points." He followed the needle's direction, turning slowly until he was facing a particular angle through the realm, looking into the deep shadow where the roots of the tree descended into distances that did not follow normal spatial logic. He said quietly, "It points toward Asgard." Mimir said, "Of course it does." He said it with the resigned tone of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of an inevitable confrontation and had stopped being surprised by the direction they always pointed. Of course, the fate of the being that exists outside fate leads directly toward the seat of the god who controls fate. He paused. The irony is so thick you could build a longship out of it. Kratos looked at the direction Atreus was facing. He looked at Saitama, who was looking at the same deep shadow with the mild, curious expression he brought to most things, his feet still hanging over the edge of the root, completely unbothered by the revelation that the world tree had just written a destiny for him. Saitama said, "Does that mean there's a way out through there?" Atreus said, "I don't know, maybe." Saitama said, "Then that's where I should go." He said it with the simple, direct logic of someone for whom most problems resolved into a question of direction and the willingness to walk in it. And the simplicity of the logic was not naivety. It was the specific, earned simplicity of someone who had removed every obstacle between themselves and any problem so many times that the path to the obstacle was the only thing left worth paying attention to. Kratos looked at him. He looked at him with the eyes that had looked at Ares and Zeus and Baldur and every other force he had ever faced, and he found in Saitama's expression the same thing the footprints had told him back on the road outside the village: a complete, unbroken absence of the weight that danger placed on people who had learned to carry it. Not because the danger wasn't real, but because the danger had never, not once, been sufficient to teach this person that it needed to be carried. He said, "If we go toward Asgard, we go toward Odin, and Odin now knows you touched the tree. He will know the tree responded. He will know you have a thread." Saitama said, "Is that bad?" Kratos said, "It means he knows something about you he didn't know before. Odin is most dangerous when he has information." Saitama nodded slowly. He said, "But he might also know how I got here." Kratos said, "Yes." Saitama said, "Then we go." He stood up from the edge of the root in one easy motion, dusted off the back of his suit, and looked at Kratos with the direct, uncomplicated readiness of someone who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the logistics to catch up. Kratos held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the boat. Then he stopped. He turned back and said, in a voice that carried something he rarely let into his voice in front of anyone, something that was not quite warning and not quite concerned but lived in the same neighborhood as both, "When we reach Asgard, what happens there will not be simple. Odin does not meet things he cannot control. He eliminates them or he converts them. He will try to convert you first because elimination has already been ruled out." Saitama said, "What does convert mean in this context?" Kratos said, "He will try to make you want something he can provide." Saitama thought about this. He said, "Like what?" Kratos looked at him. He said, "He knows you want to go home." The understanding that moved across Saitama's face at this was not alarm. It was not fear. It was something quieter and more considered, the specific expression of someone who has just realized that the simplest desire is also the most visible one, and that visibility was its own kind of vulnerability, even for a person to whom no physical vulnerability applied. He looked at the direction the needle pointed. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, but I'm not going to owe him anything." He said it quietly, with a firmness that was not aggressive but was absolute in the way that things were absolute when they came from the center of a person rather than the surface. Kratos heard it. He recognized the quality of it because he had said things in that register himself, a long time ago, and he knew what it sounded like when someone was drawing a line they intended to hold regardless of what arrived on the other side of it. He got in the boat. Atreus got in the boat. Saitama got in the boat. They moved toward Asgard through the realm between realms, following the needle, following the new thread that Yggdrasil had written into its ancient record, following the fate that had been assigned to someone who had arrived without one. And behind them the world tree continued its slow, enormous trembling, carrying its signal through every root and every branch, all the way to the edges of everything it had ever been asked to hold. Asgard from the outside was designed to communicate a single, overwhelming message, and it communicated it effectively. The golden towers caught light at angles that maximized their visual impact from every approach vector. The bridges connecting the outer structures to the central hall were wide enough to be tactically significant and ornate enough to suggest that the tactical significance was incidental to the aesthetic intention, which was a lie the architecture had been telling for centuries. The walls were not primarily defensive. They were primarily declarative, stating in the language of stone and height and permanence that the thing inside them was the kind of thing that built walls this large, and therefore the kind of thing you should think carefully about before deciding to oppose. Odin had designed this effect personally, over a very long period of time, refining it the way artists refine technique, understanding that the most effective power was the power that convinced people to accept it before it was ever applied. Kratos had walked through those gates before, in conditions significantly more violent than the present ones, and felt none of the designed effect. Saitama walked through them and looked at the towers with the mildly appreciative expression of a tourist who had been told the cathedral was impressive, and was finding that the description was more or less accurate, give or take some personal preference about architectural style. The guards at the gate had received instructions from Odin directly, which meant they stepped aside without confrontation, which meant that the elaborate social machinery of divine challenge and response that normally governed entry into Asgard was bypassed entirely, which was itself a statement, Odin choosing hospitality over hierarchy, which meant Odin had decided that the hierarchy would be reasserted through subtler mechanisms once they were inside. Kratos recognized this. He said nothing and kept walking. Odin received them in the great hall, which he had arranged with the careful attention to psychological geometry that he brought to everything. He was seated but not enthroned. The throne was present, but he had placed himself at a table instead, which communicated approachability, or the performance of approachability, without surrendering the authority that the room itself projected. He had wine on the table. He had food. He had dismissed his guards to the perimeter, which said either that he trusted the situation or that he wanted it to appear that he did, and with Odin the distinction between the genuine thing and its performance was rarely useful to look for. He looked older in person than his authority suggested, which was deliberate. Odin had discovered centuries ago that looking older than your power implied made people underestimate the power, and underestimation was the most consistently useful tool in any arsenal. He looked at Saitama with his one eye, and the one eye was doing more work than most eyes did with the full complement, reading everything visible and several things that weren't, cataloging, assessing, searching for the thread that the ravens had told him now existed. He found it. It was new and thin and strange in its texture, nothing like the threads of beings born within the system, more like something that had been added to the weave by a different hand using a different material, present but not native, written in but not of. He said, "You are Saitama," not a question. He had learned the name from the ravens, who had been close enough to the road conversation to catch it. Saitama said, "Yeah." Odin said, "You are far from home." Saitama said, "Very." Odin said, "I may be able to help with that." He said it simply, without the elaborate architecture of manipulation that he usually constructed around important offers, because he had decided, after the war room, after the Jinningagap, after a night of thinking about a being whose simplicity was its most impenetrable quality, that the most effective approach to someone who was immune to complexity was to present the thing they wanted directly and let the directness itself do the work of establishing trust. Kratos said from his position standing to one side, "Nothing from Odin is free." Odin looked at him. He said, "No, but some costs are acceptable." He turned back to Saitama. He said, "I want to understand how you arrived here. Not to replicate it, not to weaponize it, but because a door between systems that I did not know existed presents a risk to every realm I am responsible for. If there is a passage from outside Yggdrasil into the 9 realms, I need to know its nature. I need to know if it can be used again by other things, by things less unconcerned with conflict than you appear to be." He let this land. He let the logic of it sit in the room because the logic was genuine, which was the most effective kind of logic to use when making an argument you also happen to benefit from. Saitama listened to all of this. Then he said, "I told you, I was going to assail. I don't know how I got here." Odin said, "I know you don't, but Yggdrasil does." He paused. He said, "When you touched the tree, it recorded your origin point. The tree has a memory that extends beyond what I can directly access. But there are methods." old ones. If you are willing to let me look, I can find where the passage opened, and in finding it, I can find the way to send you back through it." The silence in the hall was the specific silence of an offer sitting on a table waiting to be picked up or declined, and every person present was doing their own calculation about the space between those two outcomes. Atreus was watching Odin with the focused skepticism of someone who had known him long enough to look for the thing beneath the thing being said. Kratos was watching Saitama, which was where the decision actually lived. Mimir was watching everyone and storing the information with the patience of a being who understood that the moment after a decision was often more revealing than the decision itself. Saitama said, "What do I have to do?" Odin said. "Allow me to read the thread that Yggdrasil wrote for you. I cannot do this without your awareness and presence. It requires you to remain still and open to the reading, which takes approximately an hour and which is entirely harmless to you." He said the last part without particular emphasis, which was more convincing than if he had emphasized it, because overassurance produced skepticism and understated accuracy produced the appearance of transparency. Kratos said, "And while you are performing this reading, you will learn everything Yggdrasil recorded about him, including his origin." Odin said, "Yes," Kratos said, "which is the actual thing you want?" Odin said, "It is one of the things I want. The other is what I offered. Both can be true." Kratos looked at him. He said, "They can also both be lies." Odin said, "You are welcome to observe the entire process. Any reading of a new thread is visible to anyone present during the reading. You will see everything I see." This was true, and Kratos knew it was true, and the fact that it was true was the most concerning thing Odin had said, because Odin offering genuine transparency was not in the behavioral record except in circumstances where the transparency itself served his purpose in a way that the obfuscation didn't. Saitama said, "Okay." He said it with the simple, practical acceptance of someone who had evaluated the options and found this one the most direct path toward the thing he actually wanted, which was going home. He said, "But if this is some kind of trick," he did not finish the sentence. He did not elaborate the consequence. He simply left the sentence open in the way a door was left open, and in the silence that occupied the space where the rest of the sentence should have been. Odin, who had spent centuries reading the unsaid things in half-finished statements, understood with complete clarity that the consequence being implied was something he had no instrument to measure or defend against, and that the person implying it knew that he knew this, and that this knowledge was not delivered as a threat but as a fact, with the same flat, mild certainty that had characterized every other fact this person had stated since arriving in his realm. Odin nodded. He stood up from the table. He said, "Follow me." He led them toward the inner chambers, and the great hall watched them go, watched Kratos moving with the dense, coiled readiness of a man escorting someone through a place he trusted completely, and not at all simultaneously, watched Atreus tracking everything with the intense, recording attention of someone who understood they were present at something that would require explaining later. Watched Saitama walking with his hands in his pockets through the most powerful seat of divine authority in the 9 realms, with the comfortable, unimpressed gait of a man who had once punched a meteor and found it underwhelming. The columns of Asgard's great hall rose around them, gold catching the light from above, every surface a statement about permanence and authority, and Saitama walked through it all and looked at the ceiling the way people looked at ceilings in impressive buildings, with mild appreciation that did not translate into deference, which was the one thing the ceiling had always previously succeeded in producing and was now, for the first time in its very long existence, failing to achieve. The inner chamber that Odin led them to was not a room that appeared on any map of Asgard that had ever been shared with anyone outside Odin's immediate circle, which was a circle that had been getting smaller for a very long time. It was circular, which was not incidental. Circles had specific properties in the geometry of Sather, closing the space in a way that both contained and amplified whatever was performed within them. The walls were covered in carvings that were not decorative. They were functional, each one a component of a working that had been built into the stone over centuries, layer by layer, the way geological formations built themselves, each year's addition resting on the previous one, until the whole structure was something that could not have been designed in a single moment, but could only have been grown. The carvings were runes at their foundation, but runes that had been modified and extended and connected to each other in configurations that standard runic scholarship did not recognize, because standard runic scholarship had access to what Odin had chosen to share, and what Odin had chosen to share was considerably less than what he had kept. The room smelled of something old and cold and precise, the smell of power that had been sitting in one place long enough to become part of the architecture. Odin indicated the center of the room, where the floor held a single carved circle inlaid with material that was darker than the surrounding stone and caught the light differently, absorbing rather than reflecting. He said to Saitama, "Stand here." Saitama stood there. He looked around at the carvings on the walls with the mild, interested attention he gave most things, making no particular judgment about them, simply registering that they were there and that there were a great many of them. Odin moved to a position at the edge of the room and began preparing the reading with the focused efficiency of someone who had performed this particular working many times before and had reduced it to a sequence of precise actions that required thought about execution rather than thought about sequence. He did not speak the preparation aloud. The runes activated in silence, beginning at the outer edge of the room's carved circle and moving inward, each one catching a quality of light that had not been in the room a moment before, a blue-white luminescence that was not warm and was not cold, but was the specific temperature of information, of things being made clear that had previously been obscured. Kratos stood against the wall to the left of the entrance with his arms crossed, and his eyes moving between Odin and Saitama, and the runes and the door, the 4-point surveillance of someone who had decided to trust the situation to exactly the degree required to remain in it and no further. Atreus sat on the floor near the entrance with his notebook, because Atreus in a room full of unknown and ancient Sather with his notebook was the closest thing to a natural state he had, and writing things down was both a scholarly practice and, for him, a way of staying calm when the room contained things that warranted the opposite. Mimir was watching the runes with the expression of someone recognizing fragments of something they had studied in an earlier life, pieces of a system they knew parts of, and were now seeing assembled in a configuration they hadn't encountered before. The reading began in earnest when the innermost rune activated, and the light from all of them converged on the center of the circle where Saitama was standing. It passed through him without obstruction, which was the first indication that this was going to be different from every previous reading Odin had performed, because thread readings encountered the being they were reading like light encountered a prism. The thread refracted through the person, the fate contained within them producing a pattern of interference that the room's geometry translated into information Odin could access. What the light did when it reached Saitama was not refract. It passed through him as though he were not refracting material, as though the instrument of reading and the thing being read were operating in different dimensions that happened to occupy the same physical space, and came out the other side carrying only the thread itself, new, thin, strange, with nothing of the origin system that had produced him. The room tried to read him, and found the thread Yggdrasil had written, fresh and legible, pointing toward its origin. It found nothing else. Not because he was hiding anything. The working was designed to bypass concealment, and it was functioning correctly, but because there was genuinely nothing to find. The system that had produced him had left no residue on him, no fingerprint in his fundamental nature, no trace of origin that the machinery of Yggdrasil's cosmology could recognize and read. He was a man with one piece of information attached to him, where he had come from in terms of direction, with no information attached about the nature of the place in that direction. Odin read this with increasing speed and increasing stillness, the two things moving in opposite directions, his mind accelerating through the implications as his body became quieter, both responses to the same input, both signs of the same process. He found the direction. He found the point of entry, the exact location in the structure of Yggdrasil where the passage had opened, a specific node in the root system between realms where the boundary between inside the tree and outside all trees had, at a particular moment, been thin enough for something from the other side to come through without using any mechanism the tree possessed. He found the thinness was not random. It was periodic. The node cycled through states of varying permeability on a schedule that had nothing to do with any cycle within Yggdrasil's own operation, governed instead by something external, something in the system on the other side whose rhythms occasionally synchronized with the tree's own rhythms closely enough to create a window. The window had been open. Saitama had been in the vicinity of a crab sail. The crab sail was apparently near enough to the external site of the node that when the window opened, proximity and the specific spatial quality of Saitama's presence, the way he occupied space, which was apparently a more interesting quality than it appeared, had produced an interaction. He had not fallen through. He had not been pulled through. The universe had simply found him close enough to an open door and made the entirely reasonable decision to open it a little further. Odin processed all of this. He processed the location of the node. He processed the periodicity of the cycle. He processed the next opening of the window, which the cycle told him would occur in approximately 18 hours, at a specific location in Midgard's root structure. He processed the fact that he now knew something no one else knew, something that gave him a specific, concrete, actionable piece of information that the being in the center of his reading room did not have and could not obtain without his assistance. He processed all of this in the time it took to draw a breath. Then he processed the other thing the reading had shown him. The thread Yggdrasil had written was not a complete fate. It was a direction and a destination and a single fixed point at the end of it, which was not how fates normally worked. Normal fates were long and complex, full of contingency and interaction, the product of a life embedded in the system. This thread had one point. One moment that the world tree had identified as the moment that mattered, the moment toward which the new thread pointed with the absolute certainty of fate when it had no ambiguity to accommodate. He read what the moment was. He held the information in his mind with the careful steadiness of someone holding something that could damage them if dropped. He said nothing for a long time. The runes maintained their light. Saitama stood in the center of the circle, waiting, looking at the ceiling with the patient equanimity of someone standing in a doctor's waiting room. Atreus, who was watching Odin's face and who had learned to read it over years of adversarial proximity, saw the moment when Odin's expression changed. Not dramatically, a shift in the set of the jaw, a microscopic recalibration in the eye, the kind of change that only meant something if you knew what his neutral expression looked like, and had developed a strong intuition about the distance between neutral and alarmed. Atreus knew what it looked like. He saw the change. He wrote in his notebook in his smallest handwriting 2 words, "He knows." Kratos, without looking at Atreus, said quietly, "What does he know?" Atreus said, equally quietly, more than he intended to, and something he didn't expect. Kratos looked at Odin. He saw it too, the quality of the stillness, the specific weight of a man sitting with a piece of information he had not prepared himself to receive. He said to Odin across the room, "What does the thread show?" Odin looked at him. He looked at him with the one eye, and in the eye was something that Kratos had seen there before only in the moments when Odin had encountered something that genuinely threatened the structure of his plans rather than just the execution of them. He said, "The thread has one point, one fixed fate." He paused. He looked at Saitama. He said, "It ends here. It ends now." The moment the world tree wrote as his fate was the moment he touched the root. Kratos said, "What does that mean?" Odin said, "It means Yggdrasil looked at him, wrote him in, and concluded that the entirety of his fate within this system was this single act, touching the root, waking the tree to the existence of outside." He paused again, and the pause had a quality of something being pressed down beneath it. He said, "The tree has been trying to reach outside ever since, every root, every branch moving toward the boundary." It felt outside through him, and now it wants to understand outside, and it has been pushing against the edges of everything it contains since the moment he made contact. Mimir said, very quietly, "The tree is growing." Odin said, "Yes." Mimir said, "Growing toward what?" Odin said, "Toward everything else. Everything outside. Every other system, every other cosmology, every other existence beyond Yggdrasil's current reach." He said this with the flatness of someone who had just understood something enormous and was handling it by describing it in the smallest possible words. He said, "If it reaches the boundary, if it breaks through," he stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "Every realm within every other system becomes adjacent to the 9 realms. Every god in every cosmology becomes a neighbor." He looked at Saitama. He said, with something that was not quite admiration and not quite accusation but lived between them, "He didn't break anything. He showed the tree that there was more to reach for, and the tree has been reaching ever since." Saitama had been listening to all of this. He had been standing in the center of the circle, in the converging light of 6 centuries of accumulated Sather, in the most powerful working room, in the most powerful seat of divine authority in the 9 realms, listening to the god of war and the All-Father and the smartest severed head in existence discuss the cosmological consequences of the fact that he had touched a tree with one finger out of ordinary curiosity. He said, "So I definitely broke something." He said it with the resigned, familiar tone of someone who had had this specific conversation before, not about trees and cosmologies, but about the general principle of things changing permanently in his vicinity without him intending it. He looked at Odin. He said, "Can you still send me home?" Odin looked at him. He said, "Yes. The node will open in 18 hours. I know the location." He said this, and then he said nothing else for a moment, and in the moment that he said nothing else, Kratos heard everything that the silence was withholding and said, "But," Odin said, "but if he leaves, if the being who woke the tree's awareness of outside leaves the system, the tree will lose its reference point. It will have felt the direction but will no longer have the thing that showed it the direction, and without that reference the reaching stops." Kratos said, "The tree stops growing toward outside." Odin said, "Yes," Kratos said, "and if he stays," Odin said, "the tree reaches the boundary within a decade, maybe less." The silence that this produced was total and absolute and lasted a very long time. Saitama said, "I want to go home." He said it with the same quiet, absolute firmness he had used in the boat, the firmness of a line being held. He said, "You said you'd help me go home." Odin looked at him. He looked at him with the full weight of a mind that had spent its entire existence turning situations into leverage. And he found in Saitama's expression the same thing the footprints had told Kratos and the hammer had told Thor and the runes had told the room, a complete, unbroken simplicity of intention that had no gap in it, no crack where a more complex agenda could be inserted, no ambiguity that could be shaped into a different outcome. He said, "Yes, I will help you go home." He said it because the alternative was not saying it, and not saying it meant the thing in his reading room would remain in his realm indefinitely, continuing to wake the tree to its own capacity for expansion, and the consequences of that were larger than any leverage he could extract from withholding a single passage home. He said it because it was the right calculation. He said it with the expression of a man making the right calculation and finding, for once, that the right calculation and the thing he wanted to do were not the same thing. He said it, and Saitama nodded and said, "Thank you," with genuine, uncomplicated sincerity, and Odin sat with the sincerity for a moment and found it harder to bear than most things he had faced, because sincerity from something he couldn't manipulate was a quality he had no existing response to. The runes dimmed. The light faded. The room returned to its ordinary cold and darkness, and Yggdrasil continued its slow, enormous reaching somewhere beneath and beyond, and through everything, pressing toward a boundary it had never known existed until one finger from one hand from one person from outside had touched a root, and in touching it, whispered to the oldest living thing in existence the most consequential 4 words it had ever heard. "There is more outside." The node was in the eastern root system of Yggdrasil, accessible through a specific point in the Midgard forest, where the world tree's presence was closest to the surface. Not visible, not touchable in the ordinary way, but present in the particular quality of the air and the behavior of the light through the trees, the way it arrived at angles that didn't quite correspond to the position of the sun, bending slightly around something that wasn't there in any physical sense, but was there in every sense that mattered. Odin knew the location precisely and had provided it without condition, which was the most unsettling thing he had done in the entire span of their acquaintance, according to Kratos, who had known him long enough to have a detailed inventory of his behavior and had never previously placed unconditional cooperation anywhere on that inventory. They traveled through the realm between realms in silence, the boat moving with the same steady patience it always moved with, the water that was not water parting before the hull and closing behind it, and the world trees trembling continued around them. Deeper now, more directional, the reaching Odin had described made audible in the substructure of the realm as a low, continuous resonance that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. Atreus had filled 16 pages of his notebook since the reading room. He was still writing as they traveled, his hand moving quickly, catching things before they faded, because he understood with the specific clarity of a person who had grown up, surrounded by prophecy and mythological consequence, that he was inside an event that would need explaining later, and the quality of the explanation depended entirely on the quality of the observation made while it was happening. He had written everything, the reading, the runes, Odin's face when he understood what the thread showed, the 2 words he had written himself in small handwriting, the conversation about the tree reaching, the moment Saitama said "I want to go home" with the quiet certainty of a decision that had already been made before the sentence started. He wrote it all and looked at it, and understood that he was writing the account of something that had no precedent, which meant the account itself was the first draft of whatever precedent it would eventually become. Kratos rode and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for most of the journey in the specific way that meant he was thinking rather than being silent, the 2 things looking identical from outside but carrying entirely different internal qualities. He was thinking about the tree. He was thinking about what Odin had said, every realm within every other system becomes adjacent, and he was following the implication of that forward through time, with the methodical, experienced mind of someone who had spent his life understanding that consequences always arrived always, that the bill for every action was eventually presented, and that the only relevant question was whether you were prepared to pay it when it came. An Yggdrasil that had broken through the boundary of its own cosmology. An Yggdrasil that had made the 9 realms adjacent to every other system of existence. He was thinking about what came through a door that size when it opened all the way. He was thinking about whether what came through would be Saitama, who had walked through with his hands in his pockets and asked about markets, or whether it would be things that had seen an open door and interpreted it differently. He was thinking about all of this, and arriving at conclusions he would need to spend considerably more time with before he knew what to do with them. They emerged from the realm between realms into the Midgard forest at the coordinates Odin had given them, and the forest received them with the same ancient, unhurried silence it brought to most things, the trees older here than in most places, wider and darker and more serious, the kind of trees that had been standing long enough to have formed opinions. The node was not visible. It was present, Atreus could feel it with the instruments, and with the sensitivity that Loki's blood gave him to the hidden structure of things. As a place in the air, roughly 6 feet off the ground where the quality of space changed, a point where inside and outside met, and where, in 17 hours, the window would open again, and the passage would be available. They could feel it the way you could feel a difference in air pressure without seeing what was causing it. A subtle wrongness in the texture of the space that resolved, when you looked directly at it with the right kind of attention, into the outline of something enormous and invisible and extraordinary. Saitama stood in front of it and looked at it with the focused, quiet attention he had given the realm between realms when he first saw it, genuine interest, real engagement, the specific expression he wore when something finally qualified as worth looking at. He said, "I can feel it." Atreus said, "You probably feel it differently than we do." Saitama said, "It feels like—" He paused, looking for the right words, which was an exercise he rarely bothered with because the right words for his experience were rarely available in the vocabulary of normal human conversation. He said, "Like the air is thinner on one side, like home is on the other side of something thin." He said it simply, and the simplicity of it was the most precise description of the node's quality that anyone present could have offered, because he was the only one there for whom home was actually on the other side, and proximity to home produced in him an accuracy of perception that no instrument could replicate. The 17 hours passed the way time passed when people were waiting for something, unevenly, with the specific elasticity of duration that expanded in the quiet moments and compressed in the moments of conversation, so that it felt both very long and shorter than expected when the end of it arrived. They kept watch in shifts, which was a practical decision, and also a way of giving everyone time alone with their own thoughts, which in a group containing Kratos and Atreus and Saitama and Mimir were thoughts of enormously different character pursuing enormously different questions. Saitama spent his watch sitting cross-legged in front of the node and looking at it with the patient, meditative attention of someone who was trying to memorize something. And when Atreus came to relieve him and asked what he was doing, he said he was trying to remember what it felt like so he could avoid it in future if he ever happened to be near another one. Atreus wrote this down. Kratos spent his watch sitting with his back against the largest tree and looking at the sky. He was not looking at the stars with the wonder-adjacent sentiment that stargazing implied. He was looking at the sky because the sky was above the canopy, and above the sky were the roots of the world tree pressing against the boundary of everything. And contemplating what was on the other side of that boundary was, he had decided, going to be one of the primary occupations of whatever came next for him. He had spent so long as a man defined by the gods he had killed, and the wars those killings had caused, and the world those wars had changed, and he was standing now at the edge of something so much larger than any of that, the edge of a cosmology that had just learned there were other cosmologies, and the feeling was not small. It was not comfortable. It was the feeling of the horizon moving, which was not the same as the horizon disappearing, and he held onto that distinction as the most important one available. The window opened 2 minutes before Atreus's instruments predicted it would, which was close enough to constitute confirmation, and different enough to constitute a reminder that no instrument was the thing it measured. It opened as a change in the quality of the air at the node point, a thinning that became visible barely, as a shimmer in the space that had previously only been felt, the outline of a door becoming a door, present and passable, the passage on the other side suggesting itself through the shimmer as a quality of light that was slightly different from Midgard's light, warmer and more familiar to one person present and entirely alien to everyone else. Saitama stood up. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment, and in the moment he was looking at it, the expression on his face was the most complex it had been since he arrived, not dramatic complexity, not the turbulent emotional complexity of a person at the intersection of grand forces, but the specific, quiet complexity of someone who had found what they were looking for and was taking a moment before they took it, the way people stood at thresholds. He turned around. He looked at Kratos, then at Atreus, then at Mimir, taking the round of eye contact the same way he had in the market square when they first met, direct, uncomplicated, trying to read something in people's faces with an honesty of attention that had no performance in it. He said to Kratos, "You're going to have a problem with the tree." Kratos said, "I know." Saitama said, "I don't know how to stop it. I didn't mean to start it." Kratos said, "I know that too." A pause. He said, "It is not the first time someone has caused a large problem without meaning to." He said this with a quality that was not quite humor but was the closest thing to it that Kratos reliably managed, which was a dry acknowledgement of a pattern he recognized from the inside. Saitama nodded. He looked at Atreus. He said, You wrote a lot of notes, Atreus said. I write a lot of notes about everything. Saitama said, good, someone should. He looked at Mimir. He said, you're pretty smart for a head. Mimir said, that is simultaneously the most accurate and most reductive assessment of my qualities that anyone has ever offered, and I find I am genuinely moved by it. Saitama turned back to the passage. He looked at it one more time. Then he looked over his shoulder and said, to no one specific, to all of them, to the forest and the ancient trees and the shimmer of the passage, and the trembling that was still moving through the ground from the roots of the world tree pressing outward toward everything else. He said, this place is pretty dramatic. He said it with the mild, affectionate observation of someone who had found a place genuinely interesting after expecting not to. And then he stepped forward, and through the shimmer and the passage took him in the way passages took people who had come through them. Quickly, without ceremony, without the elaboration that the significance of the moment seemed to call for. One moment he was there. The next moment he was not. The shimmer held for 3 seconds after he was gone, the door staying open at the end of its duration, and then it closed. The forest was quiet. The same ancient quiet it always had, the quiet of trees that had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. But the ground was still trembling, softly, with the signal that had been traveling through it since a single touch on a root in the realm between realms had told the oldest living thing in existence that there was more outside. Yggdrasil was still reaching. The reference point was gone, but the direction remained, encoded now in the tree's own memory, which was longer and more permanent than the memory of anything born within it. It would keep reaching. Kratos knew it would keep reaching. He stood in the forest for a long time after the passage closed and felt the trembling through his feet, and thought about what it meant to stand in a world that had just developed an appetite it had never had before. Atreus came to stand beside him. He was closing his notebook. He said, he didn't even ask our names. I mean, we told him Mimir's name and he called Mimir smart for a head. He knew my name because Odin said it. He never asked yours. Kratos said, no, Atreus said. He didn't know who you were. He didn't know what you'd done. To him you were just, he paused, looking for the right word. Kratos said, someone on the same road. Atreus looked at him. He said, is that strange? That someone could meet you and not know. Kratos thought about this. He said, no. He said it with something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but existed in the territory between them, where things lived that were too complicated to be one thing cleanly. He said, no, it is not strange. He picked up the Leviathan axe from where it rested against the tree and began walking north, back through the forest, back toward the life that had been in progress before a man in yellow had walked out of these same trees and asked a farmer about food. Atreus fell into step beside him. Mimir said, after a moment, do you think he found the crab sail? Neither of them answered. The forest held the question in its old, serious silence, and the ground continued to tremble beneath their feet, and somewhere above the canopy and above the sky, and above everything that the sky contained, the branches of Yggdrasil pressed outward with the slow, irresistible patience of something that had learned a new direction, and had all the time in all the worlds it was reaching toward to pursue it. The 9 realms would never again be the only realms. The tree had learned otherwise, and the tree did not forget.